Tonight, we're going to explore Bigfoot from a different angle. Not the legends and folklore, not the history of sightings and famous hoaxes, but something more fundamental. What would it actually take for Bigfoot to be real? We'll look at the biology that would be required, the ecological constraints that would govern such a creature, and the kind of evidence that science demands before accepting a new species. We'll examine why modern technology has changed the conversation. What physical samples have actually revealed when tested in laboratories, and how new species are properly discovered and documented. This isn't about proving or disproving anything. It's about understanding the rules of nature and the standards of evidence. By the end, you'll have a clearer sense of not just what we know about Bigfoot, but how we know what we know about anything in the natural world. Segment 1. The Biology of Impossibility. Before we dive into stories and sightings, before we talk about footprints in the mud or blurry figures caught on camera, let's take a moment to think about what Bigfoot would actually have to be if it were real. Not as a legend, not as a cultural symbol, but as a living, breathing, biological organism. A biologically real Bigfoot would have to look less like a solitary movie monster and more like a large, rare mammal population with specific, testable constraints on body size, food requirements, space needs, and social life. Thinking through those constraints carefully lets us ground the discussion in reality instead of pure fantasy, even if the evidence gathered so far does not actually support the existence of such an animal. It's an exercise in biological imagination, asking what nature would demand of a creature like this. If it walked among us. Let's single quotes as start with the most basic physical descriptions that appear again and again in eyewitness reports. People commonly describe Bigfoot as standing roughly 7 to 10 feet tall, with a body mass of several hundred pounds. Some accounts push even larger, 8 feet, 9 feet, estimates that place the creature at the very upper end of primate size or beyond it. To put this in perspective, that would make Bigfoot comparable to, or larger than the biggest great apes we know of. A large male gorilla might stand around 6 feet tall when upright and weigh in the range of 400 pounds or so. A particularly large male orangutan might reach similar weights. So we're talking about something at the absolute ceiling of known primate body size, or exceeding it. Now, body size isn't just about appearance. Size has profound implications for how an animal must live, what it must eat, how much territory it needs. A primate of that mass, 7, 8, 9 feet tall, several hundred pounds, would require a very high daily calorie intake. We're talking about an energy budget similar to, or possibly greater, than that of a large male gorilla or a bear. These are animals that spend a significant portion of their waking hours eating, foraging, searching for the concentrated sources of energy they need to keep their massive bodies functioning. To sustain that kind of intake. A real Bigfoot couldn't survive on just occasional berries plucked from bush during a leisurely walk through the forest. It would need access to calorie-dense foods, nuts, which are packed with fats and proteins, roots and tubers, which provide starches and energy, meat, whether from hunting or scavenging, fish, caught from streams and rivers, perhaps even human crops, raiding orchards, stealing from gardens, taking advantage of the concentrated nutrition that agriculture provides. This is the kind of omnivorous or opportunistic diet that most Bigfoot proponents propose, and it makes sense from a biological standpoint. A purely leafy diet, the kind that some smaller primates can get away with in tropical climates, simply would not support a huge warm-blooded biped in the temperate forests of North America. There's not enough nutritional value in leaves and grass to fuel a body that large, especially in climates where winters are cold and food becomes scarce. If Bigfoot existed and was consuming food on this scale, its metabolic demands would leave ecological signatures. There would be competition with bears over the same resources: salmon runs in rivers, berry patches, carcasses to scavenge. There would be signs of large-scale foraging, trees with bark stripped away to get at insects, logs torn apart to access grubs, areas where nuts had been systematically gathered. Orchards near forested areas might show evidence of raids, fruit taken, branches broken, large tracks in the soft earth. Fields could be disturbed, with crops damaged in ways that don't match the patterns left by deer or other known animals. These are the kinds of ecological signatures that biologists could, in principle, detect and document. They would show up in wildlife surveys, in studies of bear behavior and diet, in reports from farmers and orchard owners. And yet, for the most part, these clear patterns don't appear in the scientific literature, at least not in ways that point convincingly to an unknown large primate. But let's continue the thought experiment, because there's another biological constraint that's even more fundamental: reproduction and population dynamics. For a species to persist over time, not just years, but centuries, millennia, it needs more than just a few individuals wandering around. It needs a minimum viable population. One or two individuals, or even a handful, cannot sustain a species over the long term. Inbreeding becomes inevitable. Genetic diversity disappears, and random accidents, a harsh winter, a disease outbreak, an unlucky encounter with a predator or a human can wipe out what little remains. Conservation biology has spent decades studying what it takes for large mammal populations to survive. The estimates vary depending on the species and the environment, but a general rule emerges. A large mammal species typically needs at least hundreds, and more plausibly thousands, of individuals, spread over its range to remain viable in the long term. These numbers might sound high, but they reflect the realities of reproduction, mortality, and genetic health. Young animals die, adults have accidents, diseases spread. To buffer against all of these threats, you need numbers. What this means for Bigfoot is striking. We're not talking about a lone creature, a single individual that somehow persists decade after decade, never aging, never dying. We're talking about breeding populations, multiple males, multiple females, juveniles of various ages, infants being born, growing up, learning to survive. These populations would need to be distributed through suitable habitats, not all concentrated in one tiny pocket of forest, but spread out across regions with enough individuals in each area to find mates and reproduce successfully. A reproducing primate population would leave indirect traces that accumulate over time. Think about it. Over the course of decades, individuals would die. There would be carcasses, eventually becoming skeletons, bones scattered in the forest. Some of those bones would be found by hikers, hunters, researchers conducting wildlife surveys. There would be juvenile footprints, smaller versions of the adult tracks, showing the characteristic proportions of young animals still growing into their adult size. There would be evidence of diseases, parasites, the kinds of health issues that affect all animal populations. Mange, injuries, infections, these things would leave marks, would create vulnerable individuals that might be more easily seen or more likely to leave clear evidence. The lack of verified, skeletal remains or clear juvenile evidence is a central reason why most biologists doubt the existence of a hidden large primate population in North America. It's not that scientists are closed-minded or refuse to consider the possibility. It's that the biological requirements for a sustainable population simply don't square with the absence of physical evidence. Where are the bones? Where are the juvenile tracks? Where are the clear repeated patterns that would indicate not just one or two anomalous individuals, but a breeding population spread across a landscape? Now, let's talk about habitat, because this is where the discussion gets a bit more interesting, and where the possibility, however slim, seems slightly less implausible. The candidate regions for Bigfoot, the Pacific Northwest, parts of Canada, Alaska. These areas do contain vast stretches of forested and mountainous terrain. We're talking about millions of acres of wilderness, much of it difficult to access, rarely visited by humans except along roads and trails. Large animals can, in fact, remain rarely seen in these environments. Cougars, for instance, are notoriously elusive despite being present in many areas. Wolverines, grizzly bears in certain regions. These are animals that exist in low densities, that have large home ranges, that can go months or years without being clearly documented, even in areas where we know they live. Real Bigfoot population would need contiguous or linked habitat corridors. It couldn't survive in isolated patches of forest surrounded by cities and farmland. The animals would need to be able to move, to disperse, to find mates in other groups. Just as with bears or cougars, this implies home ranges spanning many square miles per individual. For a large omnivore living in lower productivity mountain forests, ecosystems where food is scattered and seasonal, those home ranges might need to be particularly large. An individual Bigfoot might need to travel constantly, moving through its territory to exploit different food sources as they become available through the seasons. Salmon runs in autumn, berry patches in summer, root vegetables and overwintering, insects in spring. This kind of wide-ranging lifestyle would make the animals difficult to track, difficult to predict, hard to encounter even if you were looking for them. But here's the complication: habitat fragmentation. Logging has carved roads deep into what used to be unbroken forest. Road networks crisscross the landscape, making even remote areas more accessible. Suburbs and exurbs expand outward from cities and towns, pushing development into what was recently wild land. All of this fragments the habitat, breaking up those continuous corridors that a wide-ranging animal would need. Species like bears and cougars are pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat, or they're forced into occasional conflict with humans as they try to move between isolated patches of forest. If Bigfoot existed under these constraints, we would expect to see predictable patterns. Clusters of sightings should map onto plausible habitat patches and movement corridors. We should see reports concentrated in areas with the right kind of forest cover, the right food sources, the right degree of remoteness. And to some extent, that pattern does appear. Bigfoot sightings are not evenly distributed across the landscape. They cluster in the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains of Northern California, in parts of the Rockies, in remote areas of Canada. These are places where habitat, at least in theory, could support a large, elusive mammal. But the pattern is far from perfect, And sightings also occur in places that make less biological sense. Small woodlots near towns, areas with heavy human activity, regions where the habitat seems insufficient to support even a single individual, let alone a breeding population. Let's think about lifespan and social behavior, because these factors shape what we should expect to see if Bigfoot were real. Large primates and large carnivores tend to share certain life history traits. They're long-lived, with lifespans stretching across several decades. They reproduce slowly, having relatively few offspring over the course of their lives. Think of orangutans, which might have a baby every 7 or 8 years. Think of bears, which typically have cubs every 2 to 3 years. This slow reproductive rate is tied to body size and the amount of parental investment required to raise an offspring to independence. If Bigfoot followed this pattern, and there's no reason to think it wouldn't, given its supposed size then, that life history would make each adult biologically valuable. Losing an individual would be a significant blow to the population. This would encourage certain behaviors. Territoriality, to secure access to resources and reduce dangerous encounters. Caution, to avoid threats and injuries that could be fatal. Teaching behavior, where adults show juveniles where to forage safely, how to avoid humans, how to navigate the landscape. These behaviors are common among long-lived, slow-reproducing species because survival matters so much. Socially, a real Bigfoot could take several forms. It might be mostly solitary, like male bears, which roam large territories alone except during mating season. Or it could live in small family groups, the way many primates do, a female with her offspring, perhaps, or a loose association of related individuals that forage together and share information about food sources. Either social model would require regular contact between individuals for mating. Animals couldn't be so solitary and so rare that they never encountered each other. There would need to be mechanisms for finding mates, for coordinating reproductive. Timing for ensuring that genetic exchange happened across the population. Communication would be essential. Vocalizations, the howls, screams, and whoops that appear in so many Bigfoot reports could serve this purpose, carrying across long distances in the forest to advertise territory or signal readiness to mate. Scent marking, the way bears and big cats mark their territories, leaving chemical signals on trees and rocks. Physical signs, scratches on bark, structures built from branches, nests or shelters constructed for resting. All of these are strategies that large mammals in dense forests use to communicate when visual contact is rare. Under all of these biological assumptions, the cinematic idea of Bigfoot, a single ageless forest giant that has wandered the woods for decades or centuries, simply does not work. It's biologically nonsensical. A real species would have births and deaths. Generations would turn over. Young would be born, would grow, would eventually reproduce themselves or die trying. And all of this life cycle activity, spanning decades, spanning centuries if the species has been here as long as the legends suggest, would leave an accumulating trail of physical evidence, even if sightings remained rare, even if the animals were extraordinarily elusive. The biological necessities would catch up with them. Bodies would be found, bones would turn up, juvenile tracks would appear alongside adult ones. Scat would be collected and analyzed, revealing diet and potentially yielding DNA. Parasites specific to the species would be documented. Hair samples would provide clear genetic signatures. The absence of this accumulating evidence, this pile of small physical traces that should build up over time, is what makes most biologists skeptical. It's not about being closed-minded. It's about recognizing that biology has rules, and those rules are hard to escape, even for the most elusive of creatures. The silence from the forest, the lack of bodies, bones, and genetic evidence speaks louder than the occasional ambiguous footprint or distant howl in the night. Segment 2: The Mathematics of Hidden Giants. As we continue to think about what a real Bigfoot would require, we need to shift our perspective slightly. Bigfoot only becomes biologically interesting if we treat it like any other large mammal, an animal bound by the same ecological rules that govern everything else that lives in the forest. Rules about food and space, about climate and population numbers. These aren't arbitrary restrictions. They're the fundamental mathematics of life, the equations that determine whether a species can exist in a given place or whether it simply cannot find enough energy, enough room, enough of what it needs to survive. What we're doing here is framing Bigfoot as an ecological thought experiment, asking what a hidden species would actually require to function within the real constraints of real ecosystems. Let's start with a concept from ecology called carrying capacity. Every forest, every ecosystem has limits to how much life it can support. Carrying capacity is determined by how much sunlight reaches the ground, how much water is available, how rich the soil is, how efficiently plants can convert those basic inputs into biomass, into leaves and stems and roots and seeds. That plant matter then supports herbivores, which in turn support predators and omnivores. It's a pyramid of energy, and at every level, most of the energy is lost as heat and metabolic waste. By the time you get to large predators and omnivores at the top of that pyramid, the energy available to support them is a small fraction of what entered the system as sunlight. Huge primate like Bigfoot would sit near the very top of that energy budget. It would be competing for resources with every other large animal in the forest. And those forests, even the richest of them, already support substantial populations of large mammals. Dense conifer forests in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, can support high tree densities and impressive numbers of large animals. Black bears roam through these forests. Deer browse on undergrowth. Elk move through in seasonal migrations. Cougars hunt in the shadows. All of these species are drawing from the same pool of resources, and they've evolved together over millennia, carving out niches, finding ways to coexist without completely depleting the food base. Now imagine adding another large omnivore to that mix. An undiscovered Bigfoot population would effectively represent another bear-sized drain on the system. More large bodies requiring high-calorie food. More competition for salmon runs, for berry patches, for carrion and prey. The question becomes, is there room? Is there enough surplus energy in these ecosystems to support not just the animals we know about, but also a hidden population of something even larger? The mathematics of carrying capacity suggest that there isn't much slack in the system. These ecosystems are already at or near their limits for supporting large mammals. Adding another species of that size would require either that Bigfoot is incredibly rare, living at densities so low that its impact on the food web is negligible, or that it's exploiting resources in ways that somehow don't compete with existing species, which seems biologically unlikely. And then there's habitat. Fragmentation, which reduces the effective carrying capacity even further. A continuous stretch of forest can support more large animals than the same amount of forest chopped into smaller, isolated pieces. Fragmentation happens through logging, which creates clear cuts and road networks that divide what was once unbroken. Wilderness. It happens through development, as houses and towns and infrastructure push outward into formerly wild areas. When habitat is fragmented, animals can't move as freely. They can't access all the resources they need. Breeding populations become isolated from each other, reducing genetic diversity and making each local population more vulnerable to extinction. For a wide-ranging animal like Bigfoot would have to be something that needs many square miles of territory per individual. Fragmentation is particularly devastating. It turns what might have been marginal but sufficient habitat into a patchwork that simply cannot support a viable population. Let's think carefully about food availability across the full year, because this is one of the harshest constraints any northern forest animal faces. Real populations must survive in February, not just in July. Winter is the great winnowing force in these ecosystems. When the snow is deep and the temperature drops well below freezing, when most plants are dormant and insects are nowhere to be found, when berry bushes are bare twigs and soft vegetation is buried under ice, that's when survival becomes most difficult. A Bigfoot-like primate would need enough winter calories to keep its massive body warm and functioning during the months when food is most scarce. This necessity implies several possible strategies, none of them perfect. One option is significant: reliance on stored fat. Bears do this, eating voraciously through the summer and fall, building up fat reserves, and then sleeping through much of the winter in a state of reduced metabolism. But Bigfoot sightings don't show a pattern of seasonal disappearance. Reports come in year-round, including from winter months, which suggests that if the creature exists, it's not hibernating. Another option is access to evergreen food sources, things that remain available even in winter. Roots that can be dug from frozen ground, bark stripped from trees, seeds from conifers. But these foods are generally low in calories and difficult to process, which makes it hard to fuel a large body on them alone. The more plausible strategy would be regular use of high-calorie foods. Fish, particularly salmon, which run in the fall and can sometimes be found in rivers, even into winter. Carrion, the bodies of animals that die from cold, starvation, or predation, which would provide concentrated nutrition if the Bigfoot could find them. And perhaps most controversial, but also most logical, human crops and garbage. Orchards with fruit that hangs into late autumn or is stored nearby. Agricultural fields with crops that remain after harvest. Garbage from rural homes and campgrounds. These human-associated food sources would be particularly attractive during the lean months, and exploiting them would dramatically improve winter survival odds. Seasonal food bottlenecks are what typically limit how many large predators or omnivores an area can support. It doesn't matter how abundant food is in summer if there's not enough to go around in winter. The population is capped by the harshest season, not the most generous. So when we think about how many Bigfoot a given forest could support, we need to think about February, not July. And the February carrying capacity for a huge omnivore in a northern forest is very low. This constraint alone makes the idea of a large, hidden population extremely difficult to reconcile with ecological reality. Here's another consideration. Any undocumented large omnivore exploiting those key seasonal resources, salmon runs, deer. Carcasses, farm fields would be operating in the same time windows as known wildlife. Bears are at the rivers during salmon season. Cougars and wolves are scavenging deer carcasses. Coyotes and raccoons are raiding garbage and crops. All of this activity leaves evidence. Tracks in the mud near rivers, scat filled with fish bones or berry seeds. Images on trail cameras that hunters and researchers set up to monitor wildlife. The fact that we see bears, coyotes, deer, elk, and other large mammals on these cameras all the time, but virtually never see clear images of Bigfoot is telling. The cameras are there, in the right places, at the right times. The animals are there, using those resources. But the images that would document Bigfoot, clear, unambiguous, repeated photographs showing a large, bipedal primate, those images don't appear in the scientific record. Let's talk about movement patterns, because how an animal moves through its landscape says a lot about its ecology. Large mammals in northern forests tend to show one of two strategies. Some are strongly territorial, defending and regularly patrolling a defined home range. Others are more migratory or nomadic, following seasonal movements as they track food sources and breeding opportunities. Both strategies have implications for where and when we should expect to find evidence. A territorial Bigfoot would likely defend or regularly use a multi-square mile area. It would know that territory intimately, where the best foraging sites are, where water can be found, where safe resting spots exist. And it would leave repeated sign in that area over months and years. Tracks along the same game trails. Foraging. Damage in the same berry patches each season. Bedding areas in sheltered locations, used again and again. Territorial animals create patterns in the landscape, signatures of their presence that accumulate over time. If Bigfoot were territorial, researchers focusing on specific areas over long periods should be able to document these patterns. Yet, intensive, long-term studies of supposed Bigfoot habitat don't yield the kind of consistent, repeated evidence that territorial large mammals invariably leave. The alternative is a more migratory or nomadic strategy. Some caribou travel hundreds of miles between their summer and winter ranges. Elk move from high mountain meadows down to lower valleys as snow deepens. If Bigfoot followed this kind of pattern, it would imply long-distance travel along landscape corridors, the natural highways that animals use to move through terrain. River valleys, which provide both water and easier travel through rugged country. Mountain passes, which offer routes across otherwise impassable ridges. Ridgelines themselves, which allow movement above the densest vegetation. Animals using these corridors predictably would leave evidence along them. Tracks where the soil is soft, hair caught on branches, scat deposited in regular locations. Either a territorial or a migratory pattern should produce clusters or routes of encounters rather than random, isolated dots on a map. If you map Bigfoot sightings with this ecological lens, some patterns do seem to emerge. Reports often line up along mountain chains or major river systems. They cluster in certain regions, rather than being evenly distributed. This could reflect actual ecological structuring, the kinds of patterns a real large mammal would create as it moves through suitable habitat. But it could also reflect human patterns, where people hike, where logging happens, where small communities exist near large stretches of forest. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful analysis that, Factors in both potential animal ecology and human activity patterns dot. So why do some regions generate more Bigfoot reports than others? The pattern is clear. Sightings in North America concentrate heavily in forested, mountainous, and relatively wet regions. The Pacific Northwest, particularly Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, parts of the Rocky Mountains, coastal British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska. These are the Bigfoot hotspots, the places where reports are most common, and where the creature feels most firmly rooted in local culture. These regions share certain characteristics. They combine dense forest cover with rugged mountainous terrain. They tend to have relatively low human population density compared to other parts of the continent. There are small towns and scattered rural properties, but vast stretches with very few permanent residents. And there's a psychological dimension as well. These landscapes make you feel like something big could be out there. The forests are dark and thick. Visibility is limited. Sounds are muffled by vegetation or echo strangely off rock faces and through valleys. It's easy to feel watched, easy to imagine that the forest holds secrets. From a purely ecological standpoint, high-productivity temperate rainforests and mixed conifer forests offer the best hypothetical energy base for a large omnivore. These are among the most productive terrestrial ecosystems on Earth. The combination of moderate temperatures, abundant rainfall, and long growing seasons means that plant growth is lush and sustained. More plant growth means more herbivores, which means more food for omnivores and predators. If you were going to hide a population of large primates anywhere in North America, these forests would be your best bet. They offer the most carrying capacity, the most resources, the best chance that the mathematics might somehow work out. But there's another factor that complicates the picture: culture and human activity. These same regions tend to have strong outdoor cultures. Hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, logging, all of these activities mean that people spend significant time in the woods, often off-trail, in places where wildlife encounters are more likely. This cuts both ways. On one hand, more people in the forest means more chances for genuine encounters with unusual wildlife, or more opportunities to see something rare. On the other hand, it also means more opportunities for misidentification, for seeing a bear or elk in poor conditions and interpreting it as something else. It means more people primed by local culture to think about Bigfoot, more people who've heard the stories and who have that interpretive framework readily available when they encounter something ambiguous. All of these ecological rules and constraints demand that if Bigfoot existed as a real biological entity, it would be subject to the same mathematics as bears and moose and every other large mammal. It would need enough calories per square mile to fuel its massive body. It would need enough contiguous habitat to maintain genetic diversity and allow individuals to find mates. It would need enough total individuals, hundreds at minimum, more likely thousands, to buffer against the random fluctuations and catastrophes that threaten small populations. These aren't negotiable requirements. They're not things a species can simply ignore or work around through cleverness or elusiveness. They're the hard constraints of biology and ecology. And this is where the evidence gap becomes most troubling. Sparse, random, one-time sightings are very hard to reconcile with what we should expect from hundreds or thousands of large mammals moving through real ecosystems. Large mammals leave dense webs of evidence. Tracks, yes, but also scat deposited regularly along travel routes. hair snagged on branches and caught in bark, carcasses when individuals die, feeding signs where they've foraged, trail camera images captured incidentally when cameras set up for other species happen to catch them passing by. All of this evidence should be accumulating, building up, creating a body of physical material that scientists could study. The fact that this accumulation doesn't happen, that we don't have freezers full of Bigfoot scat samples, that museums don't have collections of bones, that trail camera databases don't show repeated clear images, this absence is deafening from an ecological perspective. The areas that feel most Bigfoot friendly, those dark, atmospheric old-growth forests, those foggy mountains where visibility is measured in tens of feet rather than miles. These are precisely the landscapes where real, large mammals live on tight energy budgets. Every calorie matters. Every winter is a challenge. Populations are limited by food availability, by habitat quality, by competition with other species. There's no hidden surplus, no untapped reservoir of resources that could support a secret population of something huge and hungry, treating big. Foot as a hypothetical species inside these genuine constraints shifts the conversation in a useful way. Instead of simply asking, could anything be out there? We can ask a more precise question. Would the forests and food webs we actually have and feed such a thing at a scale sufficient for a viable population? And when we ask that question carefully, when we look at the numbers and the patterns and the ecological requirements, the answer that emerges from the data is sobering. The mathematics don't work. The energy isn't there. The evidence we should be finding isn't appearing. The forest, for all its mystery and darkness, cannot keep secrets of this magnitude. Biology has rules, and those rules are written in calories, in territory, in the relentless arithmetic of survival. Segment 3. The evidence under the microscope. We've spent time thinking about what Bigfoot would have to be as a biological organism, what the ecological constraints would demand, what patterns we should expect to see if such a creature truly existed. Now we need to turn our attention to what we actually have, the physical evidence that's been collected over decades of searching, the photographs and videos that have been analyzed, the hair samples and tissue specimens that have been sent to laboratories. Physical Bigfoot evidence has been scrutinized with modern scientific tools, and so far, everything testable has turned out to be either a hoax, a misidentification, or material from known animals. And yet, despite this consistent pattern of negative results, the stories and experiences remain culturally powerful. They continue to resonate, to matter to people, to shape how communities think about wilderness and mystery. That tension between what the scientific evidence shows and what the cultural phenomenon represents is actually perfect for understanding how science sorts stronger evidence from weaker evidence, how it builds knowledge, and how it distinguishes between different kinds of claims. Let's start with a fundamental distinction that's crucial for understanding how science approaches questions like this: the difference between physical evidence and anecdotal evidence. Scientists treat eyewitness accounts and campfire stories as anecdotal evidence. This doesn't mean they think the witnesses are lying or that the stories are worthless. Anecdotal evidence is useful for generating ideas, for pointing researchers toward interesting questions, for suggesting where to look next. If hundreds of people are reporting large bipedal creatures in a particular region, that's worth investigating. But anecdotal evidence on its own is not enough to establish a new species. Stories can be sincere and still be mistaken. Memories can be vivid and still be inaccurate. Cultural expectations can shape what people think they've seen. Physical evidence is different. Physical evidence means material that can be independently examined and retested by different researchers using different methods. Hair that can be analyzed for its microscopic structure and for its DNA sequence. Scat that can be dissected to see what the animal ate and tested genetically to identify the species. Bones that can be measured, compared to known species, and dated. Tissue samples that can be examined under microscopes and subjected to chemical analysis. Clear tracks preserved in context, not just a single print, but a series showing gait and weight distribution, photographed and measured carefully. At the site, high-quality photographs and videos where resolution is good enough to see details, where lighting and perspective can be evaluated, where the image can be compared to both known animals and to human fabrications. Bigfoot investigations have, over the years, gathered both types of evidence. There are thousands of anecdotal accounts, some of them deeply compelling, told by people who seem sincere and often have no obvious reason to lie. And there have been physical samples as well. Hair collected from fence lines and branches, scat, found in areas of reported activity, plaster casts made of large footprints, photographs, and videos of varying quality. The crucial question is, what happens when those physical samples reach formal laboratories, when they're subjected to rigorous testing by scientists who know how to analyze biological material? The answer is consistent and sobering. The samples that have been properly tested have matched known species. Bears, particularly black bears and grizzlies, deer, cows and horses, raccoons and other smaller mammals, humans. Sometimes the results show contamination or degradation that makes identification impossible. But in case after case, when the analysis works, when clean DNA can be extracted and sequenced, the result comes back as something familiar, something already cataloged in genetic databases. Ethnographies and sociologists who study Bigfoot communities have noted something interesting about how evidence is treated within those communities. There's often a mix of both forms, stories, and objects, creating a hybrid approach that sits somewhere between science-inspired collecting and traditional folklore. People talk about specimens and samples. They use scientific-sounding language. They set up research projects, collect data, present findings. But at the same time, the standards of evidence and the willingness to accept ambiguous results are quite different from what you'd find in academic biology. The community operates with 1 foot in the world of scientific methodology and 1 foot in the world of belief and tradition. Teaching. This distinction helps clarify what's at stake in different kinds of claims. I believe my friend saw something strange in the woods, and we have a new species of large primate in North America, are very different statements that require very different levels of support. The first is a statement about trust and about the inherent ambiguity of brief, surprising encounters. It's reasonable to believe your friend had an unsettling experience without committing to any particular explanation for that experience. Second is a scientific claim that requires reproducible physical evidence, peer-reviewed analysis, and integration with existing knowledge about biogeography, ecology, and primate evolution. The bar is much, much higher. Let's look more closely at specific types of physical evidence, starting with footprints. Footprints have been central to the Bigfoot phenomenon since the very beginning. since those 1958 tracks at Bluff Creek that gave the creature its modern name. Plaster casts of enormous prints have been made in locations across North America. Some of these casts show what appear to be anatomical details, dermal ridges that look like fingerprints, patterns of wear that suggest weight distribution, toe arrangements that seem distinct from human feet. But footprints are, fundamentally, easy to fake and easy to misread. Even credentialed anatomists and primatologists have found themselves changing their minds about specific casts. A print that initially looks impressive, that seems to show features inconsistent with a simple hoax, might later be recognized as probably fabricated or as more ambiguous than it first appeared. Perspective matters. Context matters. Without seeing the print in the ground, without being able to examine the soil conditions and the surrounding area, without having a series of prints showing consistent gait and depth, it's very difficult to draw firm conclusions from a plaster cast alone. Some famous Bigfoot tracks have been directly linked to hoaxes. Carved wooden feet have been found and matched to prints. People have come forward and admitted to creating tracks as pranks. In other cases, the tracks may be genuine but misinterpreted. Bare prints, particularly when they overlap or when the substrate is soft and deforms in particular ways, can mimic elongated, human-like footprints. A bear's hind paw, stepping partially into the depression left by its front paw, can create a single print that looks startlingly like a large human foot, but longer, with a shape that doesn't quite match. Without expertise and without careful examination of the surrounding prints and context, it's easy to see such a track and jump to the wrong conclusion. Photographs and videos present their own challenges. The most famous piece of footage is, of course, the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967, that brief, shaky sequence showing what appears to be a large, hair-covered bipedal creature walking through a clearing. The film has been analyzed exhaustively. Over the decades, some people see it as clear evidence of a real, unknown primate. The creature's proportions, the way it moves, the muscle movements visible under the hair, these features convince them that it cannot be a person in a suit. Others see it as an obvious costume, pointing to features they interpret as zipper lines, to proportions that seem human, to movement patterns consistent with a person walking in an awkward suit. The fundamental problem is ambiguity. The film lacks enough resolution to definitively rule out alternative explanations. The lighting is imperfect. The camera is moving. The subject is at a distance and is only visible for a short time. These limitations mean that the film cannot serve as conclusive proof, no matter how much effort is put into analyzing it. It's too ambiguous. It can't distinguish between the competing hypotheses, between genuine unknown primate, person in an elaborate costume, or even known animal misidentified due to perspective and filming conditions. And in an era of ubiquitous phone cameras and widespread trail cameras, motion-activated cameras that hunters and wildlife researchers deploy by the thousands across forests and mountains, the absence of multiple, clear, unambiguous images becomes increasingly significant. Trail cameras capture bears, cougars, deer, elk, wolves, and countless other species. They do so regularly in high resolution, from multiple angles and at different times of day. They document juvenile animals, pregnant females, individuals, with distinctive markings or injuries. They've even captured images of extremely rare species, animals that exist at very low population densities, and that were previously thought to be absent from particular regions. But clear, unambiguous images of Bigfoot, they don't appear in the scientific literature or in the databases that wildlife agencies maintain. There are occasional ambiguous shapes, a dark form at the edge of a frame, something that might be a bear standing up, or might be something else, but nothing that rises to the level of clarity we routinely see for other large mammals. For a creature that's supposedly present across a wide geographic range, that leaves large footprints and is big enough to be seen at a distance, this absence is difficult to explain if the creature is real. Good science asks a specific question about any piece of evidence. Can this evidence distinguish between competing hypotheses? A piece of evidence is only useful if it can help us decide between different possible explanations. Blurry photos and isolated footprint casts usually cannot make that distinction. They cannot separate new ape from bear standing up person. In costume, known animal misidentified, or deliberate hoax. When evidence is compatible with multiple explanations, including mundane ones, it doesn't move us closer to a definitive answer. It just adds to a pile of ambiguity. Now let's talk about DNA, remains, and trace biology, because this is where modern science has its most powerful tools. A large reproducing mammal population would inevitably shed testable traces throughout. Its habitat? Hair, caught on branches and barbed wire. Scat, deposited along travel routes and near feeding sites. Skin cells, left on surfaces the animal touches. Parasites, ticks, mites, intestinal worms that would be specific to the species, or at least show distinctive genetic signatures. And over the course of decades, inevitably, bones and carcasses. Animals die. Bodies decompose, but bones persist. In any region with a viable population of large mammals, bones turn up. Hunters find them. Hikers stumble across them. Researchers conducting field surveys collect them. One of the most rigorous studies of alleged Bigfoot evidence involved genetic analysis of hair samples. Researchers collected dozens of samples that had been submitted as potential Bigfoot or Yeti evidence, hair that people had found and preserved, believing it came from an unknown primate. These samples came from different locations, different time periods, different collectors. They were subjected to modern genetic sequencing techniques, extracting whatever DNA remained in the samples and comparing the sequences to databases containing genetic information from known species. Every single analyzable sample matched a known mammal. Bears, especially black bears and brown bears. Horses, dogs, cows and other livestock. Deer, raccoons. Some samples were too degraded to yield useful DNA, but among those that could be analyzed, not one produced a genetic sequence that didn't match something already known to science. Not one showed the distinctive signature you'd expect from a novel primate species, something related to, but clearly distinct from gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans. And humans. There have been highly publicized announcements of Bigfoot DNA over the years. The most prominent was probably Melba Ketchum's claim of finding hybrid human DNA that she attributed to Bigfoot. But these announcements have been sharply criticized by geneticists, scientists who specialize in DNA analysis, and who understand the methods and standards required for such work. The criticisms focus on poor methodology, inadequate controls, contamination issues, and results that either look indistinguishable from human DNA or are too degraded and mixed to interpret reliably. None of these claims have survived peer review or been replicated by independent laboratories. Compare this situation to how new large mammal species are actually discovered and confirmed. In recent decades, several new species of large mammals have been identified. The saola, a bovine species from Vietnam. Several new species of deer and antelope from Southeast Asia. New primates from Madagascar and South America. In every case, the process follows a similar pattern. Physical specimens are collected: bodies, bones, preserved tissue. Genetic analysis is performed by multiple laboratories. The results are published in peer-reviewed journals, where other scientists can examine the data and the methods. Type specimens. Official reference examples are deposited in museums where they can be examined by future researchers. The new species is integrated into our understanding of evolution. Biogeography and ecology. No museum, no university, no vetted scientific collection holds a verified Bigfoot skull, skeleton, or preserved body. After decades of searching, after hundreds of expeditions, after thousands of alleged encounters, and countless pieces of purported evidence, there is no physical specimen that has survived scientific scrutiny and been accepted as genuine. This absence is stark when compared to how readily new species, even rare and elusive ones, produce type specimens once serious scientific effort is directed toward finding them. The key teaching point here is about trace biology and what constitutes the gold standard for establishing a new large species. It's not about blurry photographs or eyewitness accounts, as compelling as those might be subjectively. It's about reproducible DNA sequences that can be independently verified. It's about tissue that can be examined under microscopes. That shows cellular structure and biochemistry consistent with a real organism. It's about curated remains, bones, teeth, hair, preserved in museum collections, where future scientists can re-examine them as techniques improve. This is the standard that every other species meets. It's not an unfair or impossibly high bar. It's simply what's required to make a definitive scientific claim. There's a phrase that often comes up in these discussions. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And this phrase is partly true. Failing to find something during a single search, or even during multiple searches, does not definitively prove that the thing cannot exist. Rare species can be very hard to detect. An animal that's extremely elusive, that lives at very low population density, might avoid discovery for considerable time, even when people are actively looking for it. So the absence of evidence after limited searching doesn't close the case. However, and this is crucial, when searches are repeated over decades, when technologies improve dramatically, when data accumulate from thousands of trail cameras and hundreds of field studies and millions of person hours spent in potential habitat, the continued absence of good evidence becomes increasingly meaningful. At some point, the lack of findings starts to tell us something real about the probability that the creature exists. Ecologists think about this in terms of detection effort. How much effort has been expended looking for this species? How good are the methods we're using? Would those methods be likely to detect the creature if it were really there? For a large North American primate with a population that would need to number in the hundreds or thousands to be viable, for a creature that supposedly leaves large footprints and is seen regularly enough to generate thousands of reports, the detection effort has been enormous. Decades of hunting and logging mean that people have spent countless hours in remote forests. Road building has opened up previously inaccessible areas. Trail cameras have proliferated. Professional wildlife research has surveyed potential habitat extensively. And yet, not one uncontested body or skeleton, not one clear photograph that survives rigorous scrutiny, not one DN, a sample that shows something genuinely novel. What's interesting is that Bigfoot enthusiasts themselves often adopt scientific language and methods. They talk about collecting samples. They discuss field methods and data. They present findings in formats that mimic scientific papers. This shows that both skeptics and enthusiasts are negotiating what counts as real proof. Both sides are engaging with ideas about evidence and verification, even if they draw different conclusions from the same patterns. Framing Bigfoot this way, as a case study in how science thinks about evidence, allows for a conversation that's educational without being dismissive. It shows how science weighs different kinds of evidence, how it updates beliefs as new tests are performed, how it recognizes when not enough evidence yet slowly, over time, hardens into probably not. And it does all of this without ridiculing eyewitnesses, without calling people stupid for wondering whether something might be out there, without dismissing the very real experiences that people have had. It simply asks that we distinguish between something strange happened to me, and therefore, a specific biological species exists. Those are different claims, requiring different kinds of support, and understanding that difference is key to understanding how science builds reliable knowledge about the world. Segment 4. The Age of Total Surveillance. We live in an era that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. Technology has flooded the world with cameras and sensors, creating layers upon layers of surveillance and documentation that cover even the most remote landscapes. And yet, despite this unprecedented level of technological coverage, none of these tools has produced decisive Bigfoot evidence. This doesn't make the question easier to answer. In some ways, it makes it sharper, more pointed, harder to avoid. The lack of clear evidence in an age of abundant technology forces us to refine our thinking about what's actually plausible, about what reasonable doubt looks like when the surveillance net has become so dense. Let's start with trail cameras, because they represent one of the most significant changes in how we monitor wildlife. Millions of trail and game cameras are deployed across North America at any given time. Hunters use them to monitor deer populations and movement patterns, to identify where big bucks are traveling, to decide where to set up their stands. Researchers use them to study elusive predators, to document rare species, to understand animal behavior without the disturbance that human presence creates. Landowners use them for security, to see what animals are moving through their property, sometimes to catch poachers or trespassers. These cameras are everywhere, hung on trees along game trails, positioned near water sources, scattered through forests, both public and private. And these cameras work. They're remarkably effective at their job. They capture images of elusive animals that humans rarely see. Cougars moving through territories at night, their eyes glowing in the infrared flash. Wolves traveling in packs, caught mid-stride as they pass through the camera's detection zone. Rare black bears, grizzlies in unexpected locations, even wolverines, and other creatures that exist at extremely low densities. The cameras also catch poachers, trespassers, people doing things they'd rather not have documented. The sensitivity of these devices to large moving bodies in forest environments is proven. demonstrated thousands of times over in the images they produced. So here's the puzzle. Despite this saturation of trail cameras, claimed Bigfoot images remain extremely rare. And when images do appear that people claim show Bigfoot, they're universally ambiguous. A dark shape at the edge of the frame that could be a shadow, could be a person in dark clothing, could be a bear standing on its hind legs, motion blur that makes it impossible to see details. Digital artifacts, the kinds of visual glitches that cameras produce under certain conditions, that create shapes that aren't really there. Even the images that enthusiasts point to as their best trail camera evidence are contested with skeptics, offering prosaic explanations that seem at least as plausible as the Bigfoot interpretation. Think about this statistically for a moment. A breeding population of large primates, and remember, we'd need hundreds or thousands of individuals for a viable population, would be moving through the same forests as deer and bears. They'd be using the same water sources, the same travel corridors, the same productive feeding areas. Deer show up on trail cameras constantly. Bears are photographed regularly. Even much rarer animals like cougars and wolves, which exist at far lower densities than deer, generate steady streams of trail camera images. So why doesn't Bigfoot? Why do we have at most a handful of extremely ambiguous, hotly contested frames, rather than the clear, repeated documentation we should expect from a large animal that's supposedly widespread? The lack of trail camera evidence is particularly striking because these cameras are passive. They don't require anyone to be present. They don't make noise or movement that might scare animals away. They simply wait silently, capturing whatever passes by. If Bigfoot were out there in the numbers necessary for a viable population, the cameras should be finding it, not constantly, perhaps, but regularly enough to build a convincing body of photographic evidence. The fact that this evidence hasn't materialized is difficult to explain if the creature is real. But trail cameras are just the beginning of our technological surveillance network. Earth-observing satellites circle the planet, mapping forests, tracking changes in land cover, documenting the impacts that large animals make on their environments. These satellites can see elephant trails worn into African grasslands. They can identify seal colonies on remote beaches. They can track deforestation, clear cuts, the expansion of human settlements into previously wild areas. Now, satellites cannot resolve individual animals at Bigfoot's reported size from orbit. The resolution isn't fine enough for that. A single creature, even 1/8 feet tall, is too small to show up clearly in satellite imagery. But satellites provide context, show us where habitat exists, help us understand the landscape at scales that inform where we might expect animals to be. Drones and crewed aircraft offer finer scale surveillance. Drones, in particular, have revolutionized wildlife research in recent years. They can fly low over forests, capturing high-resolution video from angles that would be impossible for ground-based observers. They're being used to track whales in the open ocean, to count orangutans in the canopy of rainforests, to monitor gorilla populations in African mountains. These are all large primates or mammals, animals living in dense vegetation or vast territories, and yet drones are finding them, documenting them, helping researchers understand their populations and movements. If a large primate population were present in North America, these tools wouldn't guarantee a clean video or a definitive image. Bigfoot could, in principle, be elusive enough to avoid drones most of the time. But the tools steadily increase the chances that something unmistakable would be captured. Over the years, over thousands of hours of drone footage and aerial surveys, covering potential Bigfoot habitat, you'd expect at least a few clear images to emerge. Something that shows an upright, hair-covered figure in enough detail to rule out the usual alternative explanations. The accumulating absence of such images weighs against the idea of a common, wide-ranging animal. It doesn't absolutely rule out a tiny, hyper-localized population, a remnant group in one isolated valley, so rare and so restricted that the odds of encountering them remain vanishingly small. But it makes the large, continent-spanning population that many reports seem to suggest increasingly implausible. And then there are smartphones. Billions of people now carry high-quality cameras in their pockets everywhere they go. Even remote hikers, even people venturing into backcountry areas, far from roads and services, often have phones capable of shooting 4K video. The potential for documentation is unprecedented. Every person in the woods is, in effect, a mobile surveillance station. If something unusual happens, they can capture it, often in remarkable detail. This ubiquity of cameras has led to what we might call evidence inflation. There's been a huge rise in the number of claimed Bigfoot clips appearing online. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. These platforms are flooded with videos that people present as potential Bigfoot evidence. But there hasn't been a corresponding rise in quality or verifiability. Most of these videos share certain characteristics. They're shot vertically, in the aspect ratio that's natural for holding a phone, but awkward for serious documentation. They're shaky, the camera moving erratically as the person filming tries to keep the subject in frame, while also reacting emotionally to what they're seeing. They're shot at extreme zoom, pushing the phone's digital zoom to its limits, which degrades image quality and makes it nearly impossible to judge scale, distance, or fine detail. In these videos, it's hard to tell whether the figure in the distance is actually large or just closer than it appears. Hard to tell whether it's moving in an unusual way or just walking normally, but filmed at an odd angle. Hard to tell whether it's covered in hair or just wearing dark clothing. The ambiguity is maximal, and the video, rather than resolving questions, just generates more of them. Was that a person? A bear? Something else? The viewer is left uncertain, and that uncertainty can be interpreted in different ways depending on what the viewer wants to believe. The ease of editing and sharing has created another problem. Hoaxes are easier to create than ever. Video editing, software that once required expensive equipment and professional training, is now available free or cheaply to anyone with a computer. AI tools can now generate or alter images in ways that are increasingly difficult to detect without careful analysis. A convincing Bigfoot video can be fabricated in an afternoon and uploaded to social media immediately. And once it's online, it spreads. People share it without verifying. It goes viral, reaches millions of viewers, and even if it's later debunked, that debunking rarely reaches the same audience that saw the original video. Misidentifications spread just as quickly. Someone films a bear at a distance. The video is ambiguous, and they or someone else labels it as potential Bigfoot evidence. The video circulates. People who want to believe see confirmation of their beliefs. Skeptics see an obvious bear. Arguments ensue in comment sections, but the video itself remains out there, part of the noisy collection of purported evidence that makes it harder, not easier, to evaluate claims seriously. The evidence pool becomes noisier rather than clearer, signal drowned out by noise. Technology cuts both ways in this discussion. On the pro-Bigfoot side, modern tools offer more opportunities than ever for a decisive capture. Imagine a clear, multi-angle trail camera series, several cameras positioned in the same area, all capturing the same creature from different perspectives as it moves through. Imagine a stabilized drone video, shot in good lighting, showing a large bipedal figure in enough detail to see musculature and movement patterns clearly. Imagine a phone clip with good context, not just a few seconds of the creature itself, but footage before and after showing the landscape, showing the person's reaction, showing them approaching the area afterward to look for tracks or other evidence. These kinds of captures are more possible now than they've ever been. The technology also enables new kinds of analysis. Databases of sightings can be compiled and mapped, with each report time-stamped and geolocated. This allows patterns to be studied quantitatively. Are sightings more common in certain seasons? Do they cluster in particular types of habitat? Are there geographical patterns that might suggest movement corridors or territories? This turns anecdotes into analyzable data, allowing researchers to look for structure and consistency that would support the biological reality of the creature. But on the skeptical side, every year that passes with more cameras, better sensors, and deeper technological coverage of the landscape without solid evidence makes the hidden population hypothesis harder to maintain, at least at any substantial scale. The burden of proof shifts. It's no longer enough to say, the forests are big and cameras are rare. Anything could be hiding out there. Now we have to contend with the fact that the forests are heavily monitored, that cameras are abundant, that even rare and elusive animals are being documented regularly. If Bigfoot isn't showing up in this dense surveillance net, we need to explain why not the same tools that could potentially reveal a real animal also expose inconsistencies and fabrications. Image metadata can reveal when and where a photo was taken, and sometimes can show whether it's been edited. Forensic analysis can detect compression artifacts that hint at manipulation. Side-by-side comparisons of videos can reveal costume seams, unnatural movement patterns, or features that match known animals rather than unknown primates. When a video goes viral claiming to show Bigfoot, skeptics and researchers can now apply sophisticated analytical tools that often reveal prosaic explanations. A person in a costume, a bear misidentified due to poor video quality, or outright digital fabrication. Why does the question narrow over time? 50 years ago, when the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot, it was entirely plausible to say, the forests are vast, cameras are rare, we've barely scratched the surface of what might be out there. The technology for monitoring wildlife was limited. Trail cameras didn't exist. Drones were decades in the future. Most people didn't carry cameras with them routinely. Satellite imagery was classified and rarely available to the public. In that context, the absence of clear evidence wasn't particularly meaningful. Of course, we hadn't documented Bigfoot. Clearly, we weren't documenting much of anything clearly. Today, the situation is completely different. We have dense, overlapping layers of technological hardware watching the landscape. The claim has to be more precise, more carefully articulated. If Bigfoot is real, given what we now know about our surveillance capabilities and the lack of clear documentation, then the creature must be either extremely rare, a population so small that encounters remain genuinely exceptional, or highly localized, confined to a tiny geographic area rather than ranging widely across North America, or unusually, almost supernaturally good at avoiding detection by technologies that readily capture other large mammals, or not what people think it is, perhaps something that exists but has been misunderstood in terms of its nature or origins. Technology has shifted the burden of proof in a fundamental way. 50 years ago, a single good photograph might have been genuinely impressive evidence. It would have represented significant effort to capture. It would have been difficult to fake convincingly, and it would have stood out against a background of very limited documentation of wildlife generally. But today, when we have millions of wildlife photographs and videos, when we're accustomed to seeing clear, high-resolution images of even the rarest animals, the expectations are different. Now we expect multiple, independent, high-quality lines of evidence that can be verified and reanalyzed. We expect the kind of documentation that would satisfy the standards applied to any other claim of a new large mammal species. Framed this way, the modern era doesn't simply disprove Bigfoot in some absolute sense. What it does is teach us something about how expanding surveillance and improving technology tighten our standards for evidence. They push the conversation away from "is anything possible?" a question with an obvious answer, since of course many things are possible, toward a more focused question: what remains plausible under this level of scrutiny? And that's a different kind of question. It requires us to think carefully about probabilities, about the implications of negative evidence, about what it would actually take for a large mammal population to remain hidden in an age where hiding has become progressively more difficult. The surveillance net keeps tightening year after year, and the spaces where mystery can persist keep shrinking. Not to zero, perhaps. There may always be room for rare, localized populations of elusive creatures. But the room for common, widespread animals that somehow evade all documentation, that space has narrowed dramatically and continues to narrow. With each passing year, each new camera deployed, each advance in the technology that makes the hidden visible. Segment 5. The Path to Scientific Reality. We've talked about what Bigfoot would require biologically, about the evidence that's been collected and tested, about how modern technology has transformed our ability to monitor wildlife. Now we need to step back and ask a broader question. What would it actually take for Bigfoot to be accepted by science? Not just believed by enthusiasts, not just discussed in documentaries and on podcasts, but formally recognized as a real species, entered into the scientific literature, given a proper taxonomic name, incorporated into our understanding of primate evolution and North American ecology. New species, when they're real, enter science through a slow, physical, and thoroughly checkable process. A hypothetical Bigfoot would have to follow those same rules, especially because it's claimed to be a large mammal, not some microscopic organism that might slip through the cracks of observation. Understanding that process helps us see that the standards being applied to Bigfoot aren't arbitrary or unfairly high. They're simply the same standards that every other species has. To meet, let's walk through how new species are actually discovered and formally recognized by science. The standard practice, refined over more than 2 centuries of biological research, is to collect physical specimens, often multiple specimens, ideally representing different sexes, different ages, perhaps different seasons or locations. These specimens can be dissected to examine their internal anatomy. They can be measured carefully, with those measurements recorded in standardized ways that allow comparison with other species. And crucially, they can be stored in museum collections, preserved for future examination. Natural history museums around the world maintain enormous collections of specimens, millions upon millions of plants, animals, fungi, and other organisms, carefully cataloged, available for researchers to study. When a biologist thinks they might have found a new species, the first step is comparison with existing reference material. Museums hold what are called type specimens, the official reference examples of known species. The researcher compares their new specimens with these types, looking at anatomy in fine detail. Are the proportions different? Are there unique features? Distinctive bone structures, unusual organ arrangements, characteristic markings or colors? The goal is to make absolutely sure that the organism isn't just a known species showing unusual traits. Animals can vary within a species. Different populations might be slightly larger or smaller, different colored, adapted to different local conditions. A true new species needs to show consistent, distinctive differences that separate it from everything already known. Modern species descriptions usually combine traditional anatomy with genetic data. DNA sequencing allows researchers to build a family tree, showing where the new species fits in relation to its closest relatives. This genetic perspective provides independent confirmation of what the anatomy suggests. If the physical differences are real and substantial, the genetic differences should reflect that. The DNA sequences should form their own distinct branch on the tree of life, clustering with close relatives, but clearly separate from them. Once the research is complete, the species is formally named and described in a peer-reviewed publication. This is a scientific paper published in a journal where other experts in the field have reviewed the work, checked the methods, examined the evidence, and agreed that the conclusions are justified. In that publication, the researchers designate a holotype specimen the single individual that becomes the official reference for the species. Forever after, if there's a question about whether something belongs to this species or not, researchers can go back to that holotype, examine it, and compare. This process is routine, even mundane, for much of life on Earth. Insects, fishes, fungi, small vertebrates. Thousands of new species are added to the scientific catalog every year using exactly these steps. Someone finds something unusual, collects specimens, does the anatomical and genetic work, publishes a description, and the species enters the books. It's how science builds its inventory of life, how we map biodiversity, how we discover the full richness of the living world. But big mammals are different, and they're different in ways that make the absence of Bigfoot evidence more significant. Newly described large mammals in recent decades, the saula discovered in Vietnam in the 1990s, various forest bovids and deer species from Southeast Asia, a few primate species from remote rainforests. These animals were often known to local people through oral tradition and hunting. But when scientists began investigating, they quickly produced the physical evidence needed for formal description. Bodies were obtained, sometimes from hunters, sometimes from markets where the animals were sold as meat. Bones were collected, hides and horns were examined, clear photographs were taken. The species moved from local knowledge to scientific recognition relatively rapidly once researchers knew where to look and had access to the regions where the animals lived. Big mammals leave disproportionate traces compared to smaller. More cryptic organisms. There are roadkills, large animals struck by vehicles on roads that pass through their habitat. Hunting trophies, taken by local people and sometimes purchased or traded by researchers. Market meat in regions where bushmeat is part of the food. Supply, bycatch in certain kinds of traps or fences. And carcasses when large animals die naturally. Their bodies are substantial enough that scavengers only partly destroy them. Bones persist. Skulls, especially, are durable and diagnostic. They end up in the hands of collectors, on the shelves of local hunters, eventually in museums. Because large mammals are rare and slow-breeding, they're also of particular interest to conservation societies and governments. When there's a credible report of a potentially new large mammal species, resources are mobilized quickly. Researchers get funding to investigate. Conservation groups want to assess the population and its habitat needs. Governments may step in to establish protections before the species can be thoroughly described scientifically. This attention accelerates the formal description and protection process. It means that unknown large mammals don't stay unknown for long. Once serious scientific effort is directed toward confirming their existence. All of this makes it much harder to hide a population of large, terrestrial, human-sized mammals than it would be to hide small frogs in some remote cloud forest, or deep-sea fishes in the abyssal zones of the ocean, or beetles that live in poorly sampled forest canopies. Those smaller, more obscure organisms can escape detection for decades or longer. They require specialized techniques to find and study. Many regions where they live have barely been surveyed by biologists. But large terrestrial mammals, especially in a place like North America, which is relatively well studied, which has extensive road networks, which has been inhabited by large populations of humans for generations, the opportunities for remaining hidden are far fewer. That's why biologists treat the claim of an unknown giant primate in North America as an extraordinary claim. It's in a completely different category of plausibility than there's one more cryptic insect species in the Amazon, or there's a new species of cave-dwelling salamander in Southeast Asia. Those claims are routine, expected. Of course there are more insects to discover. Of course there are obscure amphibians in places we've barely looked. But a primate as large as or larger than a gorilla, living in habitats that have been logged, hunted, hiked, and monitored for over a century? That's extraordinary. It would represent a massive gap in our knowledge, a failure of decades of wildlife biology and ecology that would be difficult to explain now. It's important to understand that science is conservative, but not closed-minded. Science is conservative in the sense that it starts from existing knowledge and asks new claims to meet a certain evidential standard before rewriting textbooks and changing our understanding of what exists. This conservatism protects against error. It means that the scientific catalog of species is reliable when something is officially recognized as a new species. You can trust that the evidence supporting that recognition is solid, that multiple experts have examined it, that it's been documented in ways that allow others to verify the claims. At the same time, the species discovery record shows that scientists are very willing to accept new organisms when the data support them. Some species are described within weeks of their discovery, when the evidence is clear and unambiguous. There's no institutional resistance to expanding the catalog of known species. Quite the opposite. Finding and describing new species is celebrated. It advances careers. It wins grants and recognition. Scientists want to discover new things. They're motivated to look for them, excited when they find them, eager to publish their findings. In borderline cases, when evidence is ambiguous or insufficient, researchers typically say, the data are insufficient to conclude this is a new species, rather than declaring something impossible. The door is held open. Maybe future research will clarify things. Maybe better specimens will be found. Maybe new analytical techniques will reveal patterns that aren't clear with current methods. This combination of skepticism and curiosity isn't anti-mystery. It's not about crushing wonder or refusing to accept that the world still has surprises. It's about protecting the integrity of the scientific catalog, ensuring that new species means something strong and durable, that it represents a real addition to knowledge rather than a mistake or a misidentification. So what would Bigfoot acceptance actually require? Let's be specific and concrete about this. For Bigfoot to be accepted by science as a real species, there would need to be at least one unquestioned type specimen. A body, a complete skeleton, or a comprehensive series of tissue samples that multiple laboratories can study independently. That specimen would need to be available, curated in a museum or research institution, accessible to scientists who want to examine it and verify the claims. That specimen would need to show clear anatomical differences from humans, from bears, and from all known apes. The skull structure would need to be distinct, not just slightly different in size, but showing features that place it clearly outside the range of variation in known species. The postcranial skeleton, the bones of the body, limbs, hands, and feet would need to show adaptations consistent with a large, bipedal primate, but with unique characteristics not found in humans or known fossil hominins. All of this would need to be documented in detailed measurements, in photographs from every angle, in written descriptions precise enough that other anatomists could evaluate the claims critically. Independent genetic analyses would be essential. DNA would need to be extracted from the tissues and sequenced by multiple laboratories using different methods. Those sequences would need to be consistent across labs, showing that they're real and not the result of contamination or technical error. And the sequences themselves would need to place Bigfoot on the primate family tree in a clear, interpretable way. Where does it branch off? Is it more closely related to African apes? To Asian apes? To humans? The genetic data would need to tell a coherent story that makes evolutionary sense. That can be integrated with what we know about primate evolution and biogeography. Over time, additional finds would be expected. More bones from different locations, confirming that this isn't just a single anomalous individual, but a species with a real population. More tissue samples allowing refinement of the genetic and anatomical understanding. Consistent footprints found in context with other evidence, showing locomotor patterns and validating some of the track casts that have been collected over the years. The accumulation of evidence would confirm that Bigfoot is a reproducing population, a genuine species with a history and a future, not a one-off mystery or a misidentified individual of some known species. All of these results would be published in peer-reviewed journals, not in popular books or documentary films, but in the scientific literature where claims can be evaluated, methods can be scrutinized, and data can be examined by experts. There would be debate, certainly. Whenever something significant is claimed, there's debate. That's healthy. That's how science works. Claims are challenged. Alternative explanations are proposed. Weaknesses in arguments are identified, and through that process, understanding improves and consensus eventually emerges. If Bigfoot were accepted, it would then be incorporated into all the ordinary infrastructure of biological knowledge. Field guides would include it, with descriptions of its appearance, behavior, habitat, and distribution. Museum exhibits would feature it, explaining its place in primate evolution and its significance for understanding North American ecology. Conservation policies would be developed to protect its habitat and manage potential conflicts with humans. It would become, in short, just another species, remarkable, certainly exciting for sure, but ultimately normalized within the framework of scientific knowledge. Teaching this pathway to audiences helps them understand that when scientists say, "Show me a body and a genome," this isn't arrogance or closed-mindedness. It's not scientists being stubborn or refusing to accept new ideas. It's simply the application of the same standard that every other accepted species has had to meet. Bigfoot would be no exception. The process exists. It's well established. It's been successfully applied to thousands of species. If Bigfoot is real, the path to scientific acceptance is clear and well lit. The question isn't whether science would accept the evidence if it appeared. The question is whether that evidence exists to be found, and if it does, why it hasn't appeared yet, despite decades of searching and despite the unprecedented technological tools we now have for documenting wildlife. Segment 6. Living with the Question. We've traveled through the history of Bigfoot, explored the biology that would be required, examined the evidence that's been collected, and understood the process through which new species enter science. Now, as we near the end of this journey, it's time to step back even further and ask, what is this really about? If Bigfoot is the question, then perhaps the real subject is something deeper, something about how people live with uncertainty and how we collectively decide what counts as real. These are questions that go beyond any single cryptid, beyond any particular mystery. They touch on something fundamental about human nature and about how we navigate a world that's simultaneously more knowable than ever before, and still, in so many ways, profoundly uncertain. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that tomorrow someone produces definitive proof. A body is found, examined by multiple laboratories, confirmed through genetic analysis as a genuine novel primate species. Bigfoot is real. What happens next? A confirmed Bigfoot would instantly become one of the most important zoological discoveries of the century. It would reshape primatology. Our understanding of ape and human evolution would need to be revised to account for this lineage, to explain how and when it diverged from other primates, how it came to North America, how it survived through ice, ages and ecological changes while other large mammals went extinct. The textbooks would be rewritten. The family tree of primates would gain a new branch, and scientists would scramble to understand where it fits, what it tells us about our own. Evolutionary history. Conservation policy would have to respond immediately and dramatically. Governments would need to map the creature's range, identify critical habitat, determine population size and distribution. Logging operations would face new restrictions. Development projects would be halted or rerouted. Protected areas would be established or expanded. And there would be difficult questions about how to protect both the animals and the people who live near them. Would encounters be dangerous? Would Bigfoot need to be managed like bears? with protocols for avoiding conflict? Would there be compensation for landowners whose property became restricted habitat? The political and economic implications would ripple outward, affecting industries, communities, and policies at every level. Many indigenous accounts would gain a form of public scientific validation. Stories that had been told for generations, oral traditions about forest beings and wild men, would suddenly be understood differently by mainstream institutions. This could shift how oral traditions are treated more broadly, potentially opening doors for indigenous knowledge to be taken more seriously in other contexts. But this validation could also be complicated. The scientific framing might not match the spiritual or cultural meanings that these beings held in indigenous traditions. Bigfoot as a biological species is not necessarily the same as Sasquatch as a guardian spirit or ethical figure. The relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge would need to be navigated carefully and respectfully. Outdoor culture would change in practical, immediate ways. National parks and forest services would need new safety guidelines. Information would be distributed to hikers and campers about what to do if they encounter a Bigfoot. Hunters would need protocols. Is Bigfoot a protected species? Is it ever legal to shoot one in self-defense? Tracking techniques would be developed and taught. Wildlife biologists would establish monitoring programs. There might even be Bigfoot management plans, analogous to how we manage bear populations, trying to minimize negative interactions while ensuring the species' survival. The wilderness would feel different, more inhabited, with the knowledge that something large and intelligent shares the forest with us. And beyond the scientific and policy responses, there would be a cultural explosion. Religions would debate what Bigfoot means theologically. Does its existence challenge religious narratives? Does it fit within them? Fringe groups would adopt the creature as proof of their particular theories about ancient aliens, about government cover-ups, about the inadequacy of mainstream science. Pop culture would explode with Bigfoot content, movies, documentaries, tourism. Different factions would compete to define what Bigfoot means, to claim it as symbol or proof or mascot for their worldview. One zoological discovery would spawn a wave of competing meanings, a cultural phenomenon at least as significant as the biological one. But Bigfoot has not been proven real. We live, instead, in a state of uncertainty. And that uncertainty comes with its own costs and benefits, both for believers and skeptics. For most people who believe in Bigfoot, the cost is not financial or physical, it's reputational. There's a risk of being seen as gullible, unserious, or anti-science. In certain social and professional contexts, admitting belief in Bigfoot can lead to dismissal or mockery. People might not take you as seriously about other things. Your judgment might be questioned. This reputational risk is real, and it affects how and when people express their beliefs, who they share them with, what communities they seek out. At the same time, belief can give something valuable. It provides a sense of wonder in a world that often feels too thoroughly explained, too mapped and cataloged and understood. It gives purpose. Weekend expeditions into the woods, the thrill of searching for evidence, the hope of being the one who finally proves what so many have claimed. It provides community, online forums, conferences, social media groups where people share stories and support each other's investigations. There's a feeling of participating in something live and ongoing, a mystery that hasn't been closed, a question that still matters. For many believers, these benefits outweigh the reputational costs. For some people, Bigfoot belief is intertwined with identity in deeper ways. It can be tied to rural expertise, the knowledge that comes from living close to wild land, from spending time in forests, from understanding the landscape in ways that city dwellers and academics might not. It can be tied to indigenous traditions, to family stories passed down through generations, to cultural frameworks that have always included these beings. Letting go of belief in Bigfoot in these contexts can feel like erasing part of yourself, like betraying a tradition, like accepting that your knowledge and experience don't count as much as scientific credentials and institutional authority. Skeptics face their own costs and benefits. Insisting on strong evidence can strain relationships. When a friend or family member tells you they saw Bigfoot, responding with skepticism can feel dismissive, can damage trust, can create distance. Refusing to engage with the possibility can make you seem closed-minded or arrogant. But skepticism also offers something: intellectual satisfaction in maintaining standards of evidence, trust in shared methods for determining truth, confidence that your beliefs are grounded in reproducible findings rather than wishful thinking or cultural expectations. Perhaps the healthiest stance for most people is what we might call curious but careful, keeping an open file on the question without letting it dominate your life or your thinking, acknowledging that the world still holds surprises, that our knowledge is incomplete, that it's at least conceivable that something remains undiscovered, but at the same time, recognizing that the evidence so far doesn't support belief, that the lack of physical proof is meaningful, that there are good reasons why most scientists remain skeptical. This middle position allows for wonder without requiring credulity, maintains standards without closing off possibility. There's something interesting about how unsolved mysteries function in culture. They act like campfires around which people gather. We tell stories, we argue, we test our ideas against each other's. We rehearse what we value about truth and testimony, about experience and evidence, about authority and independence. The mystery provides a safe space for these conversations, a low-stakes arena where we can explore epistemic questions about how we know what we know, without the pressure and consequences that come with more politically charged or personally relevant debates. When a mystery is definitively solved, something is lost. If a famous cryptid is revealed to be an obvious hoax, or if a creature is fully discovered and cataloged and becomes just another entry in field guides, it often fades from everyday conversation. The narrative power drains away. What was once alive with possibility becomes simply a historical curiosity. The question mark disappears, and with it goes much of what made the mystery culturally useful and psychologically compelling. Bigfoot's ambiguity allows it to do many jobs at once, to mean different things to different people. For environmentalists, it can be a symbol of wilderness, a reminder of what we stand to lose if we don't protect wild places. For skeptics, it's a test case for critical thinking, an opportunity to practice evaluating evidence and resisting the pull of appealing but unfounded claims. For people suspicious of institutions, it's a touchstone, evidence that authorities don't know everything, that experts can be wrong, that there's room for alternative perspectives. For those who crave mystery and wonder, it's a safe place to park hopes for hidden marvels, for the possibility that the world is stranger and more magical than the mundane surface suggests. because no single piece of evidence has forced a final verdict. People can tailor the story to their temperament and values. The hard-nosed skeptic can focus on the lack of physical proof, the consistent failure of samples to reveal anything novel, the way that every supposedly compelling piece of evidence eventually falls apart under scrutiny. The hopeful believer can point to the thousands of eyewitness accounts, the possibility that science's methods aren't well suited to finding rare, elusive creatures, the sense that something is out there even if it hasn't been definitively documented. And those in the middle can say, I'm not sure, but I like the question. Maintaining uncertainty as a deliberate position rather than as a failure to decide. In that sense, Bigfoot's unsolved status is not simply a failure of science to gather enough data or of believers to produce convincing proof. It's also a feature of how culture works, how we keep some questions open for ongoing negotiation. Not everything needs to be definitively resolved. Some mysteries serve us better by remaining mysterious, by continuing to generate conversation and thought and the exploration of values and methods. The process of debating Bigfoot might be more culturally valuable than any possible resolution of that debate. This brings us to the deepest layer of the question: how do we, as individuals and as a society, decide what's real? The Bigfoot debate pits different ways of knowing against each other. Personal experience, the vivid memory of seeing something strange, the conviction that comes from direct sensory encounter. Community tradition, the stories your grandparents told, the accounts that have circulated for generations, the collective knowledge of people who live close to the land. Photographs and videos, visual evidence that seems to show something, even if it's ambiguous. Lab tests, DNA sequencing, chemical analysis, the technological examination of physical samples. Institutional authority, the consensus of experts, the conclusions published in scientific journals, the official position of universities and government agencies. These different ways of knowing don't always agree. Science asks for reproducible physical evidence and is willing to say, not yet, for a very long time, even in the face of strong feelings and vivid stories. It's a conservative epistemology in the best sense. It protects against error by requiring high standards of proof. But that conservatism can feel frustrating, dismissive, or even insulting to people whose knowledge comes through other channels. Every day, life often runs on softer standards than science does. We trust friends when they tell us about their experiences. We see patterns and anecdotes. Several people report similar things, and we conclude that something is probably there, even without formal proof. We judge the emotional plausibility of a story. Does this feel true? Does it resonate with my understanding of how the world works? These standards are practical and often serve us well in daily life, but they're not sufficient for scientific claims about new species. And the tension between these different standards is where much of the Bigfoot debate really lives. Learning to see those different standards at work, to understand why they exist and what they're good for, might be more valuable than landing on a simple yes or no answer about Bigfoot. It trains us to ask a crucial question: what would I need to see to change my mind? This question cuts both ways. For believers, it asks, if not a body, if not DNA, if not clear photographs and verified physical evidence, then what? What would convince you that Bigfoot isn't real? For skeptics, it asks, what level of evidence would actually persuade you? Are you genuinely open to the possibility, or have you already decided that it's impossible, regardless of what evidence might appear? Framed this way, the Bigfoot question becomes something more than just a debate about whether a particular creature exists. It becomes a rehearsal space for bigger, more consequential issues. Climate change. How do we evaluate competing claims about complex systems, about predictions and models, about risks and uncertainties? Medical claims. How do we distinguish between genuine treatments and snake oil, between preliminary findings and established knowledge? Conspiracy theories. How do we assess claims that institutions are hiding information, that experts are lying, that the truth is being suppressed? In all of these domains, the real skill we need isn't choosing the correct answer from a multiple choice list. It's understanding how humans build, share, and test reality, how we move from uncertainty toward confidence, what standards we use, what evidence we require, and how we negotiate disagreements when people weigh evidence differently. Bigfoot, in the end, is less important than the conversations it enables, less significant than the questions it raises about knowledge and belief, about wilderness and wonder, about trust and authority, whether the creature exists as a flesh and blood animal may never be definitively settled. But the phenomenon of Bigfoot as cultural presence, as persistent mystery, as a mirror reflecting our values and anxieties that exists beyond any doubt. It's real in human minds and human communities, real in the stories we tell and the meanings we make, real in its power to spark curiosity and debate. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps some questions serve us better by remaining open, by continuing to challenge us, by refusing easy resolution. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you can carry that openness with you. The forest, in your imagination, remains vast and dark and full of possibility. Something might be out there, or nothing might be out there. And both possibilities have their own kind of beauty. The mystery persists, the question endures. And in that persistence, there's a kind of gift, a reminder that for all our knowledge, for all our technology, for all our confident explanations, the world still holds spaces where wonder can live, where we can look into the shadows and genuinely say, I don't know. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when sleep comes gently and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin, that uncertainty, that open question, that possibility of something unknown waiting just beyond the light. Sometimes that's more valuable than any answer could ever be.